Good afternoon, and welcome to this session about consumers in our changing world. My name is Damian Sammon, and I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We will be hearing from four fellows who have each done wonderful work in improving outcomes for all of us, for we are all consumers. I'll be providing more details about each speaker before I call them onto the stage, but to whet your appetite, you will be hearing from Dr. Cassandra Cross, who completed the Donald Mackay Churchill Fellowship to study methods for preventing and supporting victims of online fraud, Geoff Rowe, who recently completed the Paul Tighes Churchill Fellowship to access world's best practice in preventing and responding to elder abuse in aged care and the community, Ian Jarratt, OAM, who investigated the development, implementation, and use of unit pricing arrangements for pre-packaged groceries, and Samantha Evans, who investigated how shared equity can become a mainstream solution to housing affordability in Australia. As you hear from our speakers, make sure you add your questions into the live Q&A tab. I will ask your questions of the speakers after we have heard from all of our speakers. But first, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Cassandra Cross, who completed her Churchill Fellowship in 2011. Dr. Cassandra Cross is currently a Senior Research Fellow, Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre, and a Senior Lecturer, School of Justice, Queensland University of Technology. In 2011, while working for the Queensland Police Service, Cassandra was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to examine the prevention and support of online fraud victims worldwide. Thank you, Cassandra.
Right, hello everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for that introduction. I'm here today to talk about my fellowship and about the work that I've done since. It's been actually, I was reflecting on with the other speakers, it's actually been 10 years this week is my kind of anniversary of going on my Churchill Fellowship. So this has provided a really good opportunity for me to reflect on the last 10 years and to reflect on the significant change that the Churchill Fellowship offered me in terms of my personal life and my career and my research. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet upon today. For me in particular, that's the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. And I acknowledge the leaders past and present. In terms of online fraud, I'm sure everybody in this room who's in this session today and listening afterwards has received a fraudulent response, a fraudulent approach of some sort. And there's a lot of stereotypes out there about what fraud looks like, about the ways that it comes through into our emails, into our phones and in person. And we're I think a lot of us are very familiar with kind of the Nigerian prince, was one of the, I guess, prevalent ones a number of years ago. The one that I've got up here is just, it's the Nigerian Astronaut. And I'm not sure if how many of you have received the invitation from the Nigerian Astronaut. It was doing the rounds, I think, back in 2016. It's kind of been going around for a number of years. But essentially, it's just an updated version of the prince, where it's the Nigerian astronaut is stuck in space and needs people to help him financially in order to stop being stuck in space and to get back to Earth. And one of the reasons why I like to share this one or kind of use it is because, I mean, this one is clearly outrageous. It's clearly not true. And I think for many of us, these are the types of approaches that we tend to associate with online fraud. We tend to think that they are quite outrageous. We tend to think that they are quite obvious in how they manifest themselves. But I guess from my research and the work that I've done, this is not the standard approach. This is not the one that victims tend to respond to. This isn't the one type of approach that victims will lose their life savings over. Not to say people won't respond, but this is not really the, I guess, representative of the types of fraudulent approaches that are out there. So if we talk about fraud, I think it's really important to have a definition, to think about what the concept is and how we understand it. So fraud essentially is really about gaining a financial advantage over somebody through the use of deception. So it uses lies to manipulate, to exploit, to deceive individuals. It can occur in online and offline contexts. A lot of my work is focused in the online space, but that certainly doesn't mean that the internet created fraud. Fraud was around well before that. We usually associate fraud with direct financial advantage, so monetary transfers from one person to another, but it can also be done through getting personal credentials, personal information, and then using that to perpetrate identity fraud. There's an endless number of plot lines that exist around fraud, and I think that's one of the things that's been really interesting in my time researching this is, I guess, the unique approaches that victims have experienced, but there is always that one consistent factor in terms of victims being asked to send money at some point or being asked to send personal credentials in order for the offender to realise that financial reward. There are some categories of fraud that are quite popular. The first is advanced fee fraud, which you may not recognise that term, but would have received an approach in your inbox. It's essentially when someone's asked to send a small amount of money to receive a larger amount of money in the future. And we see it a lot in terms of business investment opportunities, lotteries, charity. There's so many different approaches that kind of use that common thread. Romance fraud is another category. It's one I've focused a lot of my time and attention on, particularly recently. It's when an individual is defrauded through the guise of a legitimate relationship. So victims are going online, dating websites, social media, other platforms, connecting with individuals that they think are legitimate, that they think are their partner in some way, establishing what they believe is a genuine relationship. And the offender is using that relationship in order to gain financial advantage and take money from the victim. Excuse me. The third category there is business email compromise fraud, which is kind of a newer category that we're seeing becoming more prevalent. Otherwise known as invoice fraud, we've seen many media accounts of that, particularly in Australia recently, where offenders exploit relationships between business colleagues and trusted suppliers. So they might infiltrate someone's inbox from a CEO, pretend to be that CEO, ask an employer for money to transfer things. They can also get in and change invoice numbers, change account numbers, so that someone's transferring what they think is an amount of money to a genuine account, but it's actually going to an offender. I did my fellowship back in 2011, so it was actually really interesting for me to go back and find some of the fraud stats that I was working with at the time around fraud victimisation in Australia. So back in 2011, the ACCC, the Australian Competition Consumer Commission, recorded that there were just over 83,000 reports of fraud in that particular year. The losses to the Australian public were reported at 85.6 million, and that was up 20 million from the year before, which was quite significant. Advanced fee fraud was the highest number of reports, which I've just mentioned earlier, followed by computer hacking, and we still see computer hacking through till today. 52% of them were being delivered by telephone, particularly across, I guess, those remote access schemes that, again, are still prevalent today. And the average loss was between $100 and $499, which was down quite significantly from the year before. When I do these stats again for most recent figures that we have available in 2020, you can see just, I guess, fraud has just grown exponentially in terms of victimisation, in terms of targeting of those globally, and in terms of the losses that have been experienced. So I think for me, it was just really interesting to go back 10 years and think about the stats and now reflect on them now and the fact that they have been increasing significantly every year. So 2020, there were 444,000 reports to ScamWatch, Report Cyber, banks, and some of the other institutions that are now combined in the data collection. There were losses of over $850 million in Australia. So if we think of 10 years ago, it was 85 million essentially, and now we're up to 850 million, which again was substantially greater in terms of the 632 the year before. Investment schemes, which is what I mentioned earlier, where people invest in what they think are kind of genuine investment opportunities, was the highest category at $328 million lost, and romance fraud was number 2. The top 3 approaches, unsurprisingly for 2020, were phishing, which I think COVID plays a lot into these particular statistics for 2020, and there's probably an entirely different discussion to be had about COVID and how it, from my perspective, has really, I guess, changed the fraud profile of many in society and I would argue, has significantly increased the vulnerabilities and likelihood of fraudulent approaches to be successful based on the different things that we're going through right now around physical restrictions, about social isolation, about that loss of connection that we have. I mean, even for us now, we're doing this all online. We were supposed to be in person. We're spending our entire lives, our personal, our leisure, our business, everything at the moment for many of us in Australia and globally is in an online environment. And that certainly opens up potential for victimisation at a scale that we haven't seen before. If we look at that third last point there, Victorians for the first time experienced the highest financial losses in Australian jurisdictions. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that, sadly, those of you that are in Melbourne, I'm very sorry, you do have the world record in terms of the longest period being in hard lockdown globally. And I think offenders have really embraced that, and they've certainly upped the ante and targeted their approaches to reflect that. Telephone reports are still the highest category of communication, and in some ways I still find that really surprising in some way, because when we think of online fraud, I think most of us think about it being over email, we think about it through the internet, but it's really important to recognise the diversity in communication platforms and that offenders target all of those platforms, it's not just one. And bank transfers now is also the highest method of payment, which is a significant shift, I think, from 10 years ago. So when I first got into this area back in 2008, the kind of stereotype transaction was somebody sending a payment via a remittance agency such as Western Union or MoneyGram, sending that to a West African country such as Nigeria or Ghana. And that was what I guess was prevalent at that stage. Whereas now we see a lot of victims here in Australia who are actually sending bank transfers to another Australian bank account. So it reduces some of the red flags that we've put out there over the years. People think that they are genuinely sending money to someone in the country, but what's actually happening is they're sending it to another victim who's been recruited as a money mule, and they're essentially laundering the funds from that victim and sending them on to other offenders. So the profile, I guess, the ways that fraud offending does occur has changed over time, and I think it's really changed to reflect some of the prevention messaging that we've put out there. This slide here, I'm not sure how well individuals can read it, but it was taken from the ACCC report, and it just has kind of a fact about each state and a fact around victimisation. And I think what's really evident in some of these stats across the states is the increase in financial losses. If we go back to that 2011 stat where the average loss was between $100,000 and $499,000, the states here, New South Wales, for example, for those that reported romance scams, the average financial loss was $42,000. For those who reported inheritance in Queensland, the average amount was $58,000. There's significant financial losses that are being incurred by victims across Australia and globally, and it's not just kind of small amounts of money that are being lost. There's certainly a lot of high volume, small transactions that are happening out there, and it's certainly worthwhile on the part of the offender to get small amounts from lots of people, but there's also individuals who are losing significant amounts of money, and it's devastating. It has life-altering consequences. The largest single loss in the ACT was $300,000. Highest in Tasmania was $200,000. I mean, I've spoken to victims who've lost several hundreds of $1,000s, even millions of dollars as a result of these schemes. Sadly, it's not just Australia, this is a global phenomenon. And these were some of the stats I was able to pull together globally from different agencies. So the US, for example, their Internet Crime and Complaint Centre, their annual report for 2019, which was pre-COVID, and we know it's escalated since then, $3.5 billion lost to fraud and kind of associated offences. Canada, 98 million, the UK, $1.2 billion pounds. And I think it's also important to recognise that it's not really just a phenomenon that affects kind of global north countries or those that are well off, but it does also have an impact across many Asian countries, across many African countries. It's truly a global crime. What's also important around these stats is that it only recognises, I guess, those that are known to victims and those who are reported. So we know from the research that very few victims will actually report, and it certainly doesn't incorporate the non-financial harms that are so significant in this space. So reflecting on my fellowship, as I mentioned, it's been a real blessing to be able to reflect on the opportunity that the fellowship gave me. So as Damian mentioned earlier, I was very lucky to receive the Donald Mackay Churchill Fellowship to study methods for preventing and supporting victims of online fraud. So at the time, I was actually working in the Queensland Police Service. I was a research analyst at that stage. I had first started researching fraud in 2008 in the Queensland Police. I'd been tasked to do this type of project. And I remember, I guess, the turning point for me in this research was when I sat down with my first victim, could have been probably early 2009, and I was just sitting at a kitchen table with an older gentleman here in Queensland, talking to him about his experiences of fraud and what had happened. And that really was a turning point for me around understanding fraud, around, I guess, acknowledging the reality of victimization and the experiences that this gentleman and subsequently many others have shared with me, and just the disparity between what actually happens and a lot of the, I guess, the misconceptions and what I would term the kind of negative stereotypes that exist in this space. So having gotten my fellowship in 2011, I was able to visit the UK, US and Canada, and I did that in October through December 2011, so 10 years ago this week. I was so fortunate to be able to gain access to 33 different agencies across these countries, over 65 professionals that I was able to speak with one-on-one and in group settings, and it spanned all the different sectors. I think what's important, and has become even more important for me in my work now, is that this isn't just a policing problem. So it's across enforcement, consumer protection, government, not-for-profits, private sector advocacy. There's a need for everyone to come together to talk about this. I originally made 21 recommendations across a number of areas. And I think one of the perhaps sad parts for me in reflecting on this is that I could essentially take my report from 2011 and I could very easily publish it today, being relevant for 2021. There has been limited, I guess, success in many ways on, I guess, moving forward and preventing losses. Instead, as we've seen like an exponential increase in terms of the number of victims targeted, the number of financial losses incurred, and the kind of subsequent and associated harms that come from that. But having said that, there has also been, I think, a lot of improvement in what's been done. So for me, my fellowship, it's kind of not understated for me to say it was a turning point in my life. It was a turning point in my career. I was able to transition from the police into academia. So I'm now currently at Queensland University of Technology in the School of Justice. And it really provided me a foundation to come into academia and to, I guess, set myself up in this research area. And it's something that I've been pursuing for nearly the 10 years that I've been here at QUT. And so since that time, I've done a lot of work. I've got a lot of publications, if anyone's interested. I've been fortunate to attract a lot of research funding and to work with some fabulous industry partners across, again, the different sectors across society. And to be able to try and share the stories from so many victims. Prior to COVID, I guess, my research is very heavily focused on victim perspectives, and I've been very privileged to be able to sit down one-on-one with those who've experienced fraud and to listen to their stories and to have them open up and share with me and the experiences that they had, the impacts of that, and then the aftermath of what's happened and the significant, I guess, change that's had on individual livelihoods. And I think one of the things that drives me in the work that I do now and will continue to do into the future is to improve that situation, because it's heartbreaking to have these conversations. It's heartbreaking to know that individuals have sustained such trauma and suffering from this, and to know that as a society we don't really acknowledge it properly to its full extent. And there are very limited resources at the moment, similar to back in 2011, in terms of addressing it and helping victims kind of move forward and recover from this. For far too many victims, this is kind of the negative turning point, and it doesn't really get any better than that. And I just don't think that's acceptable. This slide here here is really just a summary of a lot of the work that I've been able to do, but also just kind of fraud 101, as I like to call it. So we know that fraud has a very low reporting rate, that online offences even less so. I think it's less than a third of fraud is ever estimated to be reported. There was a United Nations study that essentially said 1% of cybercrime gets reported. So it's very difficult to work with stats that don't exist in terms of recognising the magnitude of the offence. We know that victims have great difficulty in trying to access what's termed the fraud justice system, and a lot of my work has focused on the inability of victims to actually lodge complaints with organisations, to actually be acknowledged and recognised for what's happened to them. The third point is around that degree of stigma and shaming. There is an incredible level of negativity associated with this, and it has such a detrimental impact in terms of exacerbating the loneliness and isolation that victims feel. Particularly with older victims, there are many who have been disowned by family and blamed for what's occurred, and it's just heartbreaking again to hear some of those stories. We know, as I've mentioned, that the impact is far greater than financial losses. So for many, it's just easy to say, oh, it's just money, I kind of need to move on, but it's so much more than that. And I think that's the part that is harder to get over in many circumstances, and that's the kind of long-lasting impacts that that are continually prevalent. And sadly, we also know that fraud's not really a priority of policing agencies, and that's historical, continues to be the case in many ways. And again, this is one of the challenges, and certainly a great area of advocacy that I've been working on with organisations, not only here in Australia, but globally, around the need to actually put resources into this and acknowledge it for what it is and the impact that it has. Fraud is successful because everyone has a vulnerability, and I think we need to acknowledge that in a way that doesn't scare everybody, but makes everyone realise just the fact that we are all vulnerable to this. It's not about particular profiles or demographics, but offenders are really good at what they do. So recognising that I'm at my 20 minutes, this is just the moving forward slide that I like to leave with everybody. That what I guess my work summarised is around trying to help people recognise fraud victimisation, that there's a disparity between what we think it is and what actually happens, that we need to acknowledge that we are all vulnerable, not to scare us, but to be able to have these conversations. We need to accept that technology won't always protect us against this. So spam filters are amazing, but we need to have that human element. And overall, what I really just want to emphasise is that I want us to create a society where we can talk openly and constructively about this in order to break down the stereotypes and break down the isolation that many individuals feel. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cassandra. That was absolutely fascinating, and a really great opportunity for you to talk about 10 years hence after you started your fellowship back in 2011. So I also thought it was interesting how you described the life-changing nature of your fellowship for you personally and professionally, and that was really wonderful to see, and so good to see that you're still doing the sort of work that you were doing back in 2011, but with such an awesome depth of expertise and experience now that you've gathered from your travels. Yeah. It's a bit sad to hear about the victim blaming that happens in these sort of situations, and it's something that as a community we probably need to do more about, and we're doing it in other areas. So more power to Elbow to do that, continue on with that good work.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Cassandra. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker now. Geoff Rowe recently completed his fellowship. Geoff is the CEO of Aged and Disability Advocacy Australia, also known as ADA Australia. ADA Australia is an advocacy and rights service based in Queensland. Geoff's career includes senior and executive positions in government and the not-for-profit sector. Geoff is an OPAN representative on the National Aged Care Alliance. I'll have to get Geoff to explain to you what OPAN stands for. It is a member of the Notifications and Immediate Action Committee of the Medical Board of Australia and member of the Community Services Industry Alliance Reform Council. Thanks very much, Geoff. Over to you.
Thanks, Damian. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm coming to you from the land of the Jarratt and Turrbal people here in Brisbane. I wanted this afternoon to really talk about some of the observations of my fellowship, which, as Damian said, is fairly recent. But also to talk about some of my observations in my role as the CEO of an aged care advocacy organisation. Aged care is one of those things that, I guess, or maybe I talk in the first instance about, if I can get this thing going, a little bit about my fellowship maybe before I launch into that. I was fortunate to do the fellowship in May, June 2019, so it is very recent, and potentially I'm one of the last people to do the overseas travel, for which I'm very grateful. The motivation for my fellowship came from a frustration that our response as a community to elder abuse is really where domestic and family violence response was 20 odd years ago. And I guess if you talk to anyone in the domestic and family violence industry at the moment, would they describe as where they're being as, a place that they're happy? They wouldn't. And I guess for me, it was a bit like, jumping in a TARDIS, trying to do some time travel and to bring Australia forward in our response. A few years ago, I went to a conference and one of the speakers used this statement: we all want to live a long life, but none of us want to get old. And I found that a really powerful statement in that it really is a good summary. I mean, we value a long life, but we don't value getting older. And interestingly, as a society, it's something that we probably need to get used to. We know at the moment that there's about just nudging 15% of the Australian population is aged over the age of 65, but by 2050, it'll really comprise 1 in 4 of us. So, almost 25% of the population will be over the age of 65. So for the changing world, you're going to see more of these grey-haired people around in your travels, if you're not one of them yourself by then. This afternoon, I really wanted to share 2 conundrums with you. And the first one, I guess I've touched on. Why is our response to elder abuse so far behind our response to domestic and family violence? And also why it is that we ask older Australians to check in their rights when they check into aged care. We do know that aged care is something that by and large we don't plan for. Our entry into aged care often occurs at a time of crisis. And so unlike other major decisions in our life where we do due diligence, at times of crisis we don't have the time for that, nor necessarily the ability. And also, I guess it's around availability. If we talk about elder abuse, I just wanted to briefly describe to you, or I guess the formal definition that stands in relation to elder abuse. And elder abuse, for those of us who work in the industry, know it can take many forms, and it can include physical abuse, psychological or emotional abuse, financial abuse, which is probably the most prevalent, sexual abuse, and most importantly, neglect. Interestingly, during my travels, the First Nations people that I met with in British Columbia had expanded their definition of elder abuse to include spiritual abuse. And that reflected a loss of connection to country and connection to the younger people. The abuse of older people in Australia affects somewhere between 12 and 2% of the older population, and it affects both men and women. The federal government has estimated that as many as 185,000 older people in Australia experience some form of abuse or neglect each year, and certainly can happen both with inside and outside the home. We know that the primary perpetrators of elder abuse are family members, and the shame associated with that. And we heard Cassandra talking about shame, where people had or embarrassment that they've been, ripped off. For many older people, there's a level of self-blame, as in, their son or daughter, their value base is something that as a parent you believe that you have passed on. So somehow or other, if you're a recipient of that abuse, that you must have done something wrong, or it be an inadequacy on your part. Interestingly, in Australia, particularly around financial abuse, there's been a term or two terms that have been adopted in their description in the media. One of them is early inheritance syndrome, or inheritance impatience. And it reflects that, and perhaps Samantha later, when she talks about housing affordability, might touch on it. But the older generation is seen as being resource rich. Often family members think that they're going to get, mum or dad's or both's finances in time, but they really need it now, and that's part of the motivation for that abuse to occur. When we talk about aged care, we often think about nursing homes, but aged care is much more than that. There are about 240,000 Australians that access a residential aged care facility or a nursing home each year, but about 1.3 million Australians actually access aged care. And I suspect that many of you over the past 18 months have heard fairly graphic stories of poor quality care that have come out through the Aged Care Royal Commission. There's been more than 70 reviews and inquiries since 2012, and the Aged Care Royal Commission released its final report earlier this year with more than 140 recommendations for reform. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And, I guess my concern is that somewhere along the line, government is going to feel like they have done their job, they have responded. And I guess when we think about the many Royal Commissions that have occurred in recent years, their life in the public domain is relatively short. So when we look at some of the things that came out of the Royal Commission that impact both on aged care and elder abuse, some of the things that that were highlighted in that report is that that human rights, or a human rights basis, was absent. The Aged Care Act, for example, does not make reference to human rights. So the first recommendation that came out of the Royal Commission's report was that a new Aged Care Act needed to be brought into being, and it had to be underpinned by human rights. But sadly, we're already seeing a government that's now talking about principles rather than human rights. Part of the issue that's contributing to both elder abuse and the quality of care issues that we're seeing in aged care is ageism. I had the opportunity when I was in Vancouver to meet with Dr. Gloria Gutman, who was one of the co-founders of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. So a pretty remarkable woman, still in academia, in her 90s, I suspect. You never ask a woman what her age is. But she made this very simple but strong statement that ageism allows elder abuse to happen. And I think that's absolutely true. Our understanding of capacity needs to change. And I guess I use the analogy frequently that people see our capacity or our loss of capacity as being similar to pregnancy, that you either have capacity or you don't have capacity. But capacity is something that operates on a continuum. And part of our ageist response is to say, mum, dad has an impairment, or, has impaired capacity, and therefore can't make decisions and needs someone else, a substitute decision maker, to make all of the decisions for them. But all of us are able to make decisions each day. Perhaps it's the complexity of the level of decision or how much support we need that really is the defining, the defining thing in terms of what decisions are made by ourselves or with the support of others. Related to capacity are issues around enduring powers of attorney. And as an aged care advocate, we frequently see and hear about someone's attorney going into aged care and saying, I'm mum's attorney, she's not to have visitors, she's not to have spending money, she's certainly not to go out, and no phone calls. And the aged care provider will say, you're the attorney? That's fine, we will do that. And I guess our lack of understanding of the role of an attorney leads to abuse occurring. So it's really important for all of us, whether we're making a power of attorney, to understand what it's really about, or whether we've been asked to be someone's attorney, so that we can not make decisions in the best interest of the person, but make the sorts of decisions that that person would have made themselves. When we look at the changing world, it's very easy to look at the population that the aged care sector will be supporting as being a static group of people. They're older people. But I know when I started working in the role at ADA, one of the early conversations I had with the team was around, tell me about the people who you support. And they talked about the people being the grateful generation. They're a population who has grown up during the war, grown up during the Depression, are reluctant to complain, and are very grateful for everything that they get. When we look at the generational change that we're experiencing, we know that the baby boomer generation is knocking on the door of aged care. And no one's ever described them as grateful. They're a generation that when they've seen something and they don't like it, they've changed it. And I guess a really good, simple example of that is childbirth. And I have my mum who has dementia, who will at times on repeat talk about the phone call she heard the matron make to my father when I was born, saying, congratulations, Mr. Rowe, it's a boy. And Dad was at home, as you were in that day. Nowadays, if we look at the birth of a child, you can have whoever you want there. You can have, your partner, you can have your siblings, you can have your friends, you can have the whole neighbourhood. How did that happen? It wasn't driven by the health system. It was driven by the baby boomer generation. So the challenge for aged care going forward is that it must respond to the changing world that we're experiencing. You've heard me talk a little bit about human rights, and I thought it was worthy just to put up the formal definition of human rights. But what are human rights? They recognise the inherent value of each person. They recognise that each of us should be able to make the decisions that impact our lives, that we should be treated fairly, and ourselves treating others fairly. And absolutely, we should be able to take risks. Going briefly to my fellowship, the standout observation for me, which was really one of most concern, was Australia's failure to recognise that older people have the same human rights as the rest of the community. Our legislative and service responses don't operate from a rights base. And I saw that rights base as operating really effectively in a number of countries. And I'll, in a few moments, talk a little bit about some of what I saw at South Central Foundation in Alaska. The other couple of observations I just wanted to mention was around collaboration. And there was a real importance and a power associated with a collaborative response being provided at both the systemic and individual level to elder abuse. And much like I saw in child protection in years gone by, where you had multidisciplinary teams working through, talking, working on the response, I was seeing that happening for elder abuse overseas. And at the moment, we're involved in a pilot project on the Gold Coast, which is following that lead and which is quite exciting. A couple of the other observations I wanted to touch on was around legal and law enforcement. And I guess elder abuse is a crime and it has to be treated as such. And too often we see that it's a family matter. And time and time again, I hear stories where someone has gone to the police and they've said, it's a family matter, we don't deal with it. I did have this very surreal experience in New York where I was invited to the monthly DOMSTAT meeting at NYPD, and sitting in a room of 120 police officers all packing huge guns, talking about domestic violence, talking about elder abuse and their response. It was really quite amazing. Related to that is mandatory reporting, and I guess mandatory reporting speaks for itself. Again, it's making everyone responsible for how they deal with elder abuse. I wanted to talk a little bit about the success, or one of the success stories I saw, and it came out of Anchorage, Alaska. And it was around the NUCA system of care. And the South Central Foundation is a First Nations health service in Anchorage that supports about 62,000 people across Alaska. And it was the most un-hospital, un-health service that I've ever seen. And then NUCA model is a relationship-based approach where the patient, or the older person, because they also operate aged care services, is the customer owner. And it was really the lead of the customer owner that transformed healthcare, informed aged care, and improved their outcomes, and also reduced their costs. And the model's built on the simple belief that the relationship between the primary care team, or the aged care team, and the patient is the single most important tool in managing chronic disease, controlling healthcare costs, and improving the overall wellness of the population. And that focus on relationship extends beyond the healthcare delivery system. They actually have transformed the whole systems that the organisation runs on, right down to workforce development, compliance, human resources and finances. And it really is trying to ingrain that organisation-wide focus on relationship building and shared decision-making. One of the positives of COVID has been that the NUCA training that South Central Foundation has historically offered as an annual conference has gone virtual, and so there is an opportunity for people to access more information than was available pre my fellowship, but also can access some information right here, right now. My closing remarks, probably no surprise, elder abuse is underreported and our response is inadequate. And while I talked about in Australia it impacts on 2 to 12% of the population, some of the research coming out of New York was that only 1 in 24 cases of elder abuse are actually reported. And so I suspect it is far, far bigger than what we see. And some of the financial abuse, while Cassandra has talked about, significant amounts of money, I have to say, we are seeing the same within the elder abuse environment. We recently supported an older client whose son had effectively taken $5 million of her assets for his own use. So we're not talking about, small impact family matters. We're talking about, a crime. Collaboration is a very powerful tool in preventing and responding to elder abuse. And as we go forward, older Australians must not be required to check in their rights when checking into aged care. Aged care has to be rights-based. To achieve the changes to elder abuse that for those of us who work in the industry, both in elder abuse and aged care, investment and support by government is required, not only just in the short term. And, I have to say the federal government made a significant contribution in response to the Aged Care Royal Commission in the 2021 federal budget. But there's a need to do more. The response, which equates to about $2.5 billion annually, is far short of the costings that have been done to fully implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission, and that was estimated at around $15 billion a year. Going forward into the future, we need to have a system where the starting point is that older people have rights, whether it's in respect of aged care or whether it's in respect of elder abuse. And the system must support and enforce rights. We can't have a system which is dependent on an older person asserting their rights. And I guess for each of us, as I was thinking about where to from here, the cynic in me that has worked in government and outside of government knows that government responds to issues that the community think are important. So as a society, we must see an effective aged care system, an appropriate response to elder abuse as being an issue worth investing in. For each of us, we should be taking an opportunity where we can to talk about aged care, to talk about elder abuse, to talk about how can we support the most vulnerable members of our society. And I guess I have had a number of opportunities to work with Ken Wyatt when he was Minister for Seniors, and he often talked about that it was, and perhaps it was from his Indigenous heritage, he talked about how the society we have is a product of the hard work and investment made by the older people that we should be supporting. So we must recognise that investment and continue to make the world a better place than it is. That's my presentation. Thank you. I've put at the end of the slide the website for ADA Australia and also our Community Legal Centre, ADA Law. There's lots of quite good resources available on that, and there's certainly further information about South Central Foundation. So thank you.
Absolutely fascinating presentation, and I was really interested to hear the comparison you made between the way we deal with aged care and elder abuse in this country being where domestic and family violence was like 20 years ago. For people who are interested who didn't go to the community justice session, Ben Bjarnson made a really interesting presentation that you'll be able to come back to online about domestic and family violence and its impact on LGBTI communities as well, and how that's an emerging sort of area of interest. Certainly something that Ben has done a lot of work on with respect to his fellowship and subsequently since working with the police. I was also really interested to observe how your fellowships have really crossed that bridge between the very, very intensely and deeply personal aspects of elder abuse being meted out by family and other close contacts of an older person, and the entirely constructed aged care system that we have. And what a challenging sort of area it is to straddle for you and your colleagues. In terms of what happens in the future, I hope that the baby boomers have a positive effect with the, I suppose, the greater demands than they've had the grateful generation. So we'll have to wait and see. So thanks again, Geoff. I really appreciate that. That was a really good presentation.
Thanks, Damian.
I'd like to now introduce Ian Jarratt, OAM. Ian Jarratt is a retired economist and a volunteer consumer advocate. Ian's 2006 Churchill Fellowship enabled him to study the provision by grocery retailers of unit pricing, which is pricing per unit of measure for prepackaged products in several countries. Unit pricing helps consumers to compare the value of different package sizes, brands, and products, etc., and thus to make more informed choices. Welcome, Ian. Thanks for your presentation.
Thanks, Damian, and good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you can hear me okay. As you can see, the title of my presentation is Grocery Unit Pricing, which is quite a mundane and everyday topic compared to the topics of the two previous speakers. This is what I'm going to cover this afternoon. I'm going to give a bit of background to unit pricing, talk about the fellowship, learnings from the fellowship, the achievements of the fellowship and subsequently, and also give you one or two tips about how to use grocery unit pricing and how we might work together to achieve better and more unit pricing. So just a bit of background. I thought I'd start by making sure that you are aware of that the fact that a unit price is simply the price of a product or a service expressed per unit of measurement. Secondly, the unit price is the price of a product. Secondly, unit prices greatly increase price transparency and thus facilitate informed consumer choice, as Damian said. Thirdly, and unfortunately, unit pricing of grocery products is a bit complicated by the fact that they are sold and priced in three different ways. And you probably recognize these, but you probably know the top one quite well because that's the newcomer on the block, where we've got unit pricing provided for fixed weight packs, and that was what my fellowship was all about. But it's important to remember that we've also, forever, we've had unit pricing for unpackaged products when we buy things like apples loose on the left-hand side. And in the last 30 or so years, we've also got products in variable weight packs, like the chicken on the right-hand side there, for which the unit price is provided. Importantly, this means that a very effective grocery unit pricing system requires that the unit prices used for these three selling methods be compatible and consistent, and I can't overemphasize the importance of that. The last important point about unit pricing is that widespread use of grocery unit prices can produce major benefits for consumers and for the economy. This is because by comparing unit prices, consumers can significantly reduce the amount they spend on groceries or get more for the same expenditure. In addition, they can save themselves time by not having to calculate unit prices themselves. Also, and I think this is relevant to Geoff and Sandra, equity, fairness, and social justice can be increased if vulnerable or disadvantaged consumers, including those with disability, are aware of and can use unit pricing. And lastly, competition between businesses is increased when people use unit pricing. To get a good idea about the potential benefits, let's take Australia as an example. We spend about $100 billion a year on grocery products. That might surprise you. It's a huge amount, and that works out to an average of about $10,000 per household. And of course, many households spend much more than the average. And unit prices vary greatly, so consumers who use them to compare the value of grocery products can achieve major savings on their grocery bills. For example, by changing only the brand of a basket of packaged goods, it's possible to save over 40%. And by changing only the pack size within a brand, you can save over 20%. And when products are sold loose from bulk and prepackaged, by choosing the lowest unit priced items, you can save 19%. And it's not just as simple as applying those rules, because they don't always work, like buy a bigger pack or buy a low priced brand. So obviously there's great scope for many Australian households to make very significant savings or to get more for the same expenditure by comparing the unit prices of grocery products. And now I'd like to tell you briefly about why I became interested in, and some people would say passionate about, unit pricing, and also about my fellowship. I'm a retired economist with a long-standing interest in how providing effective information can make markets much more effective. And in 2003, soon after I'd retired, I learned that the United Kingdom had just started to require supermarkets to provide the price per unit of measure for items sold in constant measure packages. That was the new thing. I recognized that this would be very good for Australia, but soon learned that grocery retailers did not and were not required to provide the unit price for these packaged products, but they had to for products sold loose from bulk or in packages of variable weight. I also learned that previous attempts by consumer advocates had failed to get retailers to voluntarily provide unit pricing for these packaged products or to get governments to require its provision. I also learned that products sold in constant measure packages were extremely numerous, and the package sizes and the unit prices varied enormously. And lastly, and most relevant to my fellowship, I discovered there was a great lack of reliable information about whether unit pricing for constant measure packages was provided in many other countries, and if so, how and what the benefit and costs were. Looking back, it's hard to believe that the Australian government said then that providing this type of unit pricing would be too complex and too expensive, and that consumers wouldn't use it anyway. Or that government said that if unit pricing was beneficial for consumers, retailers would provide it voluntarily. So after doing some desk research and establishing contacts overseas, in 2006 I decided to apply for a Churchill Fellowship and was awarded one to study grocery unit pricing, especially for constant measure packages. I undertook my 7-week fellowship in early 2007, and I went to the USA, Ireland, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and to the European Union headquarters in Belgium. Like all fellows, I learned an enormous amount from what I saw and the people I met, and I'm still in contact with several of them. In Sweden, I had a pleasant unexpected bonus because in Stockholm, I was able to visit an exhibition of Winston Churchill's paintings and writings at the Nobel Museum. The exhibition catalogue I bought is now in the Trust's library in Canberra. And here's a photograph of me outside the museum on a fairly chilly April day. Winston, I presume you know, was quite an accomplished painter and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 for his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. So what did I learn from my fellowship? Well, the first thing was that I discovered that the provision of unit pricing was mandatory in supermarkets in the European Union and in a few states in the USA, where it all started many years ago. And it was also in other states in the USA, it was provided voluntarily quite frequently by supermarkets. I learned also that for well-run computerized supermarkets, the cost of providing unit prices was very low relative to their turnover. Importantly, I learned that unit prices were used by high proportions of consumers in the European Union and in the USA, and that if provided effectively, they could greatly assist consumers to make well-informed choices between products. However, unfortunately, I discovered that often the quality of provision was low. Interestingly, I found that providing unit pricing for packaged products was regarded in these places as an important step in the evolution of grocery retailing and of consumer protection and competition policies. And finally, I learned that compulsory, well-planned, implemented and maintained unit pricing systems had many advantages over voluntary systems. So my recommendation was pretty clear-cut. Australia should have a compulsory, not a voluntary unit pricing system for prepackaged grocery products, and it should be regulated by Commonwealth legislation. Turning now to what the fellowship achieved. In Australia, the main achievement was that in December 2009, only 2.5 years after the fellowship, very large Australian supermarkets and some online sellers were required to provide the unit price of grocery products sold in constant measure packages, and they've had to ever since. This was achieved much quicker than I had expected, mainly because of campaigning for it by me and other consumer advocates, plus some good luck and some good timing. The main elements of the campaign were, firstly, after the fellowship, I and other advocates used my report to inform political parties, consumer groups, the media, government officials, and retailers about the opportunities and need for grocery unit pricing, especially about the possible savings for consumers on their grocery bills, because this was becoming an important political issue. The second element of the campaign was that after the ALP won the 2007 federal election and announced plans for an ACCC inquiry into retail grocery prices, we successfully campaigned for the terms of reference to include unit pricing. The campaign's successes also included the Queensland government announcing plans for its own compulsory scheme and the introduction in the Senate of a private member's bill for compulsory unit pricing. These were very important achievements, and in conjunction with submissions from many consumer groups, plus the fact that the new supermarket entrant, Aldi, had voluntarily introduced unit pricing into all its stores, undoubtedly influenced the ACCC recommending the compulsory provision of unit pricing for prepackaged grocery products. The federal government quickly supported the ACCC's recommendation. The Queensland government decided not to proceed with its own scheme, and the mandatory industry code of conduct administered by the ACCC came into full effect in December 2009. This was, of course, a major victory for Australian consumers, and we're still seeing the benefits of it today. However, it was not the end of the campaign, because I and others have campaigned continuously since 2009 for retailers to provide more effective grocery unit pricing and for more consumer education about it. This is because while the code has some requirements that are very beneficial for consumers, and a high proportion of consumers use unit pricing, some of the code's requirements substantially reduce the benefits being obtained. For example, the requirement that unit prices be prominent and legible, but without any clear indication of how that would be assessed, has resulted in far too many unit prices being too difficult for consumers with normal vision, let alone those with defective vision or reduced mobility, to easily notice and read. And you're very probably very familiar, if you use unit pricing, with these types of unit price labels on the bottom shelves in the supermarket, where it's virtually impossible from a standing position to read the unit pricing. There are also many other problems with the code that I don't have time to talk about here, but I'd be happy to take questions on later. Yet despite all this, unfortunately, the code has not been improved since it started in 2009. Despite surveys which show that a high proportion of consumers have problems with the current system, continuous campaigning for improvements by me and other consumer advocates, and even proposals for changes made by the ACCC and some retailers. Unbelievably, a new code that started just a few days contains exactly the same requirements as the previous one. However, I and other consumer advocates continue to advocate for better and more unit pricing of groceries. Plus, we want unit pricing to also be provided by non-grocery retailers, such as pharmacies for non-prescription items and by hardware stores. This is required in many European countries and in the UK. Imagine how helpful that would be here. Since my fellowship, I've also publicised overseas the benefits possible from the provision of effective unit pricing, and this has contributed to several achievements, including the publication of an international standards organisation standard on unit pricing and of national voluntary guidelines in the USA. I've also helped to get improvements to the UK's pricing system and mandatory provision being required in Washington, D.C. in the USA. I've also helped establish an international network of people interested in unit pricing and stimulated increased research on the topic. And very recently, a draft recommendation was made by the New Zealand Commerce Commission for the mandatory provision of grocery unit pricing in New Zealand. That's a terrific development. So let's have a look at how did I achieve this, or how did the campaign achieve this? Well, first of all, and really importantly, the fellowship was a terrific start. Secondly, I've been willing to spend a lot of time on research and advocacy. Thirdly, I've had the great support of numerous organisations here in Australia and overseas. I've been able to make frequent use of the media. And also, and very importantly, the benefits of unit pricing have spoken for themselves because the benefits are so large relative to the costs. I thought I'd end with some information about unit pricing that you might find useful, and that how you can help the campaign for better and more unit pricing. So firstly, about how to use grocery unit pricing. My first tip for you is that there are far more ways that you can use it to compare values than you probably realize. I expect that those of you that use unit pricing, and I hope there are many, use it mainly to make the first 4 comparisons on this list. Compare package sizes, compare brands, compare packaged and non-packaged products, and compare regular prices and special offers. However, few of you probably compare the unit prices of products that are in different types of packaging, where there's different forms of product, for example, fresh, chilled, or frozen, or canned, or if the packaging has different levels of convenience, or make comparisons between similar or substitute products, or even between retailers, because did you realize that the pack sizes of the same product and the same brand can differ between retailers? Grocery unit pricing also makes it much easier for you to notice and take account of pack size downsizing, not when it's not accompanied by reductions in price. I call this the packet racket or shrinkflation. As I mentioned earlier, by using unit pricing, you can make better informed choices and as a result save money and time, or you can get more for the same amount of money. And some people use it to switch to higher priced unit priced products when they realize there's quite a small difference between the unit prices. However, even if these benefits are not important to you, please still consider using unit pricing at least sometimes when you shop, because this will increase competition and that will benefit all consumers. Well, how can we achieve better and more unit pricing? Even though most consumers say they have problems with unit pricing, very few complain to the ACCC about it. And the government has used this as one of the main reasons for not improving or expanding the system. Therefore, you can help to get better unit pricing by complaining to the ACCC if you encounter in supermarkets, online or in printed adverts, any of the following unit pricing problems: insufficient prominence or legibility, not being close to the selling price, the use of inconsistent units of measure for different items of the same product, non-provision of unit pricing or provision only for some items, and just outright inaccuracy. And I've given you the ACCC contact information if you're interested in doing that. And if you're really keen, you can contact me here to learn more about how you might be able to participate in the ongoing campaign for better and more unit pricing in Australia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was absolutely interesting and fascinating for all of us to hear that. And I did note that you commenced your presentation with a description of your presentation being a bit mundane. But really, I think that really is the strength of unit pricing. It's something that we use every day of the week. And the more of us use it, the more savings that accumulate. It enables people to spend money on other things that they need. So well done to you. Thank you for that. I can also make the observation from being around the Fair Trading Policy Development Network at the time that Ian's advocacy was absolutely pivotal to developing a more robust Australian unit pricing system than otherwise would have been implemented. And you could see, having heard Ian in person, how powerful that advocacy is and how solidly backed with research and expertise it is. So thank you once again, Ian. That was a wonderful presentation. So our fourth and final speaker is Samantha Evans. Samantha is going to speak about something that should be really top of mind for so many of us. We're talking about the ongoing and somewhat worsening housing affordability crisis. Samantha travelled overseas as part of a 2018 Churchill Fellowship to study shared equity. So to introduce Samantha, Samantha is a respected and highly sought after property professional with more than 25 years experience in the housing sector in Australia and abroad. A graduate of James Cook University, Nottingham Trent University in the UK, Stanford University Graduate Business School in the US, and Harvard Business School in the US, Samantha began her career at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute and has since held a number of coveted positions within the industry, including Chief Executive Officer. So I'd like to welcome Samantha.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Damian. Really appreciate that introduction. Look, my presentation is going to be an interesting one. I would think that we're going to be having two very separate conversations in this presentation. So I'm going to certainly start off with the shared equity piece, which was obviously the foundations of my Churchill Fellowship, and also sort of talk about other consumers and other considerations that I'm certainly doing with the fun of a pandemic influencing your sort of career outcomes. So So my background, as Damian sort of suggested, is very much focused on the affordable housing and social housing space, and been very lucky to operate both here in Australia and also the UK. And during that journey, I met so many families who, they had enough income that they might be able to maintain a mortgage, but the deposit component was really fundamentally challenging. And so they were always stuck in that sort of private rental market component, and the leap to home ownership was just too significant for them to leap. And I think, if you look at the last sort of 10, 11 years, we had the global financial crisis in 2011, and that certainly, well, actually longer than that, that had a massive impact on sort of the credit requirements of lending. More recently, we had the Royal Commission into the financial services industry, which once again tightened up the credit requirements, which had really substantial impacts, particularly people with lower to moderate income housing requirements. And, more recently, even if you look at the post-COVID environment, we're now looking at a circumstance where, September last year, we had, from September last year quarter to this quarter, we're talking at, over 20% increases in house prices. So you're looking at not just in the sort of major capital cities, but also in regional centres as well, which is really unheard of. But as we sit here today in a virtual conference, we're starting to realise that we can do more and more without necessarily sitting in an office space to do so. So in that context, I think shared equity, it's a product that sits neatly between the sort of private rental environment and traditional home ownership. And what I was seeing was that it had been growing in scale, not just as niche products, but as a very much a mainstream asset class in both the UK and the US. And as a viable way for households to make that first step onto the property ladder. So I was lucky enough to go to the US and UK and very much experience sort of how they have created this new asset class in the marketplace. Like many of you, had the opportunity to travel to some fantastic places, and that nourishment and joy that you get from being able to really focus on your own growth and your own capability was a blessing, and one I'm certainly very grateful for on a daily basis. Now, to give a very simple guidance about where shared equity fits, as I talked about, it neatly sits in between the sort of private rental environment and the traditional home ownership. There are sort of three different ways that shared equity has been adopted and implemented overseas, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. But I think the other thing just to look at with this diagram, and I was very lucky to meet Rick Jacobus, who's the author of this diagram, in my travels, and you can look at this diagram in two ways. One is, I guess, the level of subsidy that's required to deliver the shared equity. So the subsidy retention models are usually much heavier in terms of the level of subsidy required for them to operate and work successfully, through to the sort of shared equity loans, which require significantly less subsidy to operate. The other consideration which this diagram represents is the subsidy retention models are usually driven through the benefit to a broader community, not just the individual household that's trying to enter into the home ownership environment, whereas shared equity loans are usually only relating to that particular household. So I'll give you a little bit of a rundown on each of those different models. So subsidy retention models, there's lots of them, and I don't have the time to go through all of them, but I certainly recommend having a look at the report. It does go into each of the different models. But in its simplest model, it's probably easiest just to explain a practical example of how it works. So in this context, the purchaser will basically buy a $300,000 home, but their contribution to that purchase is, let's say, for this simple example, $200,000. So we've got an equity partner that's essentially providing $100,000 worth of benefit so that that particular household can enter into the market. Let's say in a few years' time, the property is revalued, and luckily the property has gone up by $100,000. So there's $100,000 of capital growth that is now available. In this context, the original equity partner they take a larger proportion of the uplift. So in this context, as an example, they take $75,000 or 3/4 of the capital growth. And the reason why they take a larger amount is because the intent is that benefit, that uplift, is used to reinvest into other household requirements. So being able to provide additional subsidy to other households. The homeowner, though, has come in at $200,000 in a market that they traditionally wouldn't have been able to access, and they've had the benefit of the uplift of around about $25,000. It's probably also worth just clarifying that this is it, obviously, when a market is appreciating. Something to consider is that these models also protect the home buyer when the market depreciates. So I think there's also an added advantage, particularly to people who are entering into home ownership for the first time, that these models also provide that level of protection as well. And that's explained a little bit more in the report. The next category is called shared ownership, and this is extremely prevalent in the UK. Hundreds of thousands of homes have been delivered through the shared ownership model. In its simplistic terms, and using this as an example, for example, the home purchaser will purchase the property for 75% of what the value of the property is. So again, making properties a little bit more accessible to the home purchaser. And they will enter into a pretty standard mortgage arrangement for that particular 75% and be responsible like any other homeowner in terms of their obligations in terms of a mortgage. For the other component, which in the case of the UK is delivered by the government, they pay a rent, and it's very much an affordable nominal rent as an expectation, and that is basically provided back to the equity contributor, which is the government in the UK. The particular home buyer has opportunities, so let's say they want to either through revaluation, or they may want to improve, that might be an inheritance or something that brings in additional wealth. They have the opportunity to buy additional percentages of their home. So over time, they can buy the whole home outright, and this is called staircasing. And this has had a huge impact in the marketplace and really transitioning a high number of people in the private rental into home ownership. But it has required a substantial level of subsidy intervention by the government to do so. Sort of final category is a shared equity loan. Again, fairly similar to the others, where you're working with an equity partner. They will provide a top up to whatever the home purchaser can afford, but they usually will take a larger share in any capital appreciation. And what we noticed in the US and the UK was that this is the market where we're finding a lot more private players rather than sort of government intervention. It requires a little less subsidy. And so there is a broadening market now operating beyond the sort of government supported programs that I've seen elsewhere. The other sort of key challenge, I guess, with shared equity loans is because we're playing with the private market, they're going to manage their risk and look at mitigations. And as such, they very much look at sort of only investing in medium to high markets. So there are limitations to this model simply because certainly with the way it's been applied using private contributors or equity partners, they're a little bit more selective in the locations that they'll invest in. But nonetheless, this is getting significant prominence and growing market share in both the US and the UK. In terms of applicability to Australia, look, we're very limited because I guess the political landscape and the policy landscape doesn't lend itself to a government either at a federal or state level wanting to invest substantial levels of subsidy into a program like this. And as such, I think the outcomes from the fellowship very much sort of looked at the shared equity loan piece as probably the most likely opportunity and approach that the Australian market could pick up. Where there is a government body called the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation. It's a federal body, and they've been tasked with providing a substantial number of sort of low-cost loans to a fairly targeted marketplace here in Australia. And I think they're probably the most logical custodians of the sort of shared equity style loan strategy across the country. And so one of the key recommendations is obviously working with NIFIC to look at ways that shared equity could be adopted as one of their sort of mainstream strategies in the marketplace. Now, like many people, in 2020 was an interesting year for all of us, and I'm no different, to be perfectly honest. And I think it gave me an opportunity to kind of reassess my career and explore new directions. And I ended up in a place that I never thought I would be, which is in the racing industry. And so applying my sort of finance and development expertise, sort of in that new context. The racing industry in Queensland, we have 125 racing clubs. I didn't realise there were even 125 racing clubs in Queensland, to be perfectly honest. Many of them, let's say half, only have one race a year. So they are in very much regional and remote locations. And a big part of what we do is looking at investment in from, you know, small project like $10,000 up to a $40 million new infrastructure. So a very large contrast to certainly my sort of career in the last couple of years. So in the context of this session, which is about consumers, it's been a significant change in consumer focus from the sort of low to moderate income Australian families trying to get onto the housing market to sort of the racing punter, the animal trainer owner, jockey, drivers, racing enthusiasts, of which if you could see me, you would realise I couldn't be a jockey, so I don't have this natural knowledge of the industry. And I guess the change in my focus is very much about sort of animal safety and care, the importance of integrity in this industry, the patron experience to another consumer group, and obviously in the country creating sort of community hubs and you know, delivering some of the largest annual events in some of these regional communities. I land on this slide thinking that anyone who's joining this group right now is wondering why they're looking at a country experience at this point in time. But again, it's about consumers. And for me, you know, looking in the country environment, in this context, I've got consumers that are the horses themselves, the jockeys in terms of maintaining their safety. It's about making sure that when we invest in local communities, we're using local contractors, investing in the local economic prosperity of those regional locations. And it's about making sure these locations and what we provide in patrons facilities are, you know, going to draw people to the country, are going to give them that experience that, you know, if anyone has managed to get to Birdsville or Cloncurry or Charleville, you know, they are really once in a lifetime experiences for you and your family. And yeah, so I've been very much changed my consumer focus very much, as you can see in this slide. I guess the other sort of key part for me in terms of the other sort of consumers that I need to consider is working with the racing industry themselves. They're not used to looking at a floor plan and understanding what that might look like. So giving them an immersive experience, getting them to understand how new infrastructure can work, can operate, will interact, will deliver their business outcomes. And so we use a lot of this sort of these frameworks which allow people who are not necessarily with the infrastructure expertise to understand and look and feel how the experience might be for that particular industry. Sorry, keep going. For patron experience, again, looking at, you know, we're very lucky here in Australia, in Queensland, with the announcement of the Olympics for 2032. And while we're all very excited for those 2 amazing weeks in 11 years' time, there's a real opportunity, I guess, for the consumer, particularly here in Southeast Queensland, to look at ways we can really enhance the patron experience. These examples are a proposed sort of overhaul of the Eagle Farm precinct here in Brisbane. Again, looking at how we can create spaces for, again, a different consumer group, not just the punters and people having a lovely day out, as you can see in these images, but also creating spaces where people can come and enjoy. It might be, you know, kids' formals, it could be expos, it could be conferences such as this one. So looking at ways that, again, we can consider the consumer a little bit more broadly than just the sort of racing punter. Another learning for me has been the change. One of my other key consumers is the TV viewer. Again, they are probably the fundamental group that we focus on. They're not all going to the racetrack to participate. And so looking at sort of innovative ways that we can engage with that consumer group. And for this example, it was sort of coming up with some drone experiences. So again, that the consumer has a very different experience, a more immersive experience of the racing that we're presenting. And to be honest, the most important consumer, again, never thought this was it, but it's the animals themselves. I've got black caviar here. I haven't met black caviar yet, but they are the #1 consumer for me in this new role. And it's very much about making sure that what we're creating for the industry is solely focused on the animal safety outcomes. So, for example, looking at how racetracks are built, looking at the cambers, looking at the way the animals operate. We have animal physiologists who look at how the animal actually runs so that we can ensure that the tracks themselves are as safe as possible. For the horses, it's about making sure that the turf is appropriate. So we have agronomists who are constantly looking at, making sure that the turf and what have you is as safe as possible for the horse and jockey. So again, my consumer focus has very much changed to a very different sort of landscape to the shared equity environment. And again, looking at the animal wellbeing, it's not just about racing, it's also about the sort of outcomes we can create for animal welfare. So it's, it might be hydrotherapy like this equine pool, or in this very hot climate here in Queensland, misters in stables or what have you. Again, all about animal safety and outcomes. So I guess the learnings for me, it's interesting because I was going to say I felt like a bit of a fraud coming and doing a presentation on shared equity, but now I've seen Cassandra's presentation, I'm going to be a bit more cautious in the use of the word fraud. But I think, for me, it was a question about, how do you present something that you've essentially had to walk away from for at least a short period of time. And I think it's what I've learned from the Churchill Fellowship is it's okay, because the experience you've had as a Churchill Fellow is with you for life, whether you're, continuing to fight the good fight like Ian talked about and Geoff talked about, or whether you're applying those learnings to a new environment. I think that they're equally relevant and valuable. And I think also the experience of the Churchill Fellowship sort of put me out of my comfort zone a little bit. And I think that also gave me the confidence to kind of take a leap and try something quite fundamentally different to what I had been doing for the majority of my career. And I guess just summing up this sort of consumer group, I think it doesn't really matter. The consumer outcomes are critical, regardless of the consumers you're focused on. And I think changing that focus doesn't change your intent and purpose to want to make a difference to consumer outcomes. And finally, look, a thank you. As with everyone, it's been a blessing to have this opportunity. It's a contrasting experience, certainly in my life at this point in time, but I'm extremely grateful. And the lessons I've learned from the Churchill are with me every day. So, yes, thank you for listening. And I hope one day we can all see each other face to face very soon.
Thanks, Samantha. That was a really good presentation. Really interesting to hear from you how mainstream some of these shared equity products are in the US and the UK, and really how relatively unknown they are in this country. I've also made the observation that we live in a society and a political sort of policy landscape where governments seem to be really interested in pushing up the price of housing, but government at the same time needs to be part of the solution if we're going to make housing more affordable and more accessible to people who won't be able to afford it as these prices continue to skyrocket. I was also really interested to hear how you've translated those skills that you've developed as a fellow, both professionally and what it's meant for you as a person, into a new industry. And I was really interested to hear the whole new sort of framework you put over the work that you do, even though it's not particularly similar to the industry you used to work in. And I'm sure for many fellows, that's a question that sits in the back of the mind. Do I have to stay in this particular industry forever, or can I take what I've learned personally and professionally and apply that in a new way? So thank you very much for providing those insights. So I think we jump now to the Q&A, and I think will be put up on the Brady Bunch type framework. I've just been reminded that Ken Horrigan, the president of the Churchill Fellows Association of Queensland, is going to be doing concluding remarks at 3:30. So I'll just let people know that we'll have to end the session properly at 3:30 so that we can all return to the main stage. And after Ken makes his concluding remarks, there will be the launch of the RSA partnership and the last speed networking session. So without anything further, we have a few questions that have appeared in the live Q&A chat, so people can continue to add those in. I might start the ball by relaying a question from Jackie Charles, who asked this question of Cassandra. Cassandra's asked, what is the balance between social engineering and phishing scams? And are most victims manipulated by social engineering type scams?
Thank you very much, Jackie, for that question. I think it raises an important point, and I guess something I just wanted to say, just having reflected on my presentation, was that I don't think it's all bad. I know it was doom and gloom and the stats are terrible and victims experience such devastating losses, but I do think there has been progress, and part of it relates to this question, because I think what I've certainly done in my research, and I think what we've learnt in the last decade, is the sophistication and complexity of how offenders actually perpetrate these offences. So I think 10 years ago, it was very easy to kind of think that kind of victims are greedy and gullible, uneducated, should know better, and that you're kind of foolish. The onus is placed on you for having responded. But what the research is starting to indicate is, I guess, the effective techniques that offenders use. So they use established grooming techniques that we know in child exploitation. They use social engineering techniques, as you've talked about, in terms of invoking authority and urgency, and those also kind of social marketing business techniques that work really well for us as consumers as well. And some of the work that I've focused on in my recent research is the use of psychological abuse to perpetrate these types of offences. So offenders are using these really, I guess, effective techniques to overcome, I guess, some of the barriers or some of the ways that we think about these things. And it's really hard. And I think what we need to do is to better understand how fraud's perpetrated and how they target our vulnerabilities in this way in order to be able to respond to it, to be able to have discussions about it and to prevent it from happening.
The questioner would like to know, how can we as a community, and I think we mean that in this question in the broadest possible sense, how can we as a community ensure that older people's rights are upheld?
Thanks, Damian. Look, I guess my immediate thought was the statement that or the approach that the environmental movement has adopted, and that's about thinking globally and acting locally. And so, you know, or if I quote Mrs. Hillman, a dear old neighbour that I grew up next to, and she was this woman in her 80s who could apparently solve any issue. And she, I guess, brought the approach of, you know, how we approach a problem is like how we eat an elephant, and we take it in bite-sized pieces. And when you think about eating an elephant, you're not going to take a bite out of the underbelly where it's just going to fold in on itself. You're going to take a bite out of the ear where someone can see that you're starting to make progress. So, you know, I guess that eating an elephant approach, as tacky as the analogy is the way that I would be approaching it, you know, not only as an individual, but as a community. So it's about, you know, having zero tolerance. It's about talking to your friends. It's about calling out ageist behaviour, you know, when you see it, when you hear it, and even when you hear yourself, you know, using it. And I guess knowing that change requires political will, it's about bringing it onto the agenda, talking about what sort of aged care system that we want as we look forward. And, you know, we all have, you know, while we may not today be a user of aged care services ourselves, we will often find ourselves with a family member, you know, be it a parent, an aunt or an uncle, you know, who is looking at aged care. And so helping them articulate what sort of system it is that we want and what we're prepared to tolerate, I think is incredibly important. So bite-sized pieces, but, you know, have a bite every day would be my advice.
That's great advice. Thanks, Geoff. I've got a question for Ian. Ian, I was really interested to hear you talk about how you used the outcome of your fellowship studies to progress unit pricing reform in Australia. So what tips would you give people listening about how to leverage off other groups and other bodies in the community as one person who's come back with all this information to achieve your policy goals?
Thanks, Damian. I think that's crucially important. We would not have achieved what we have done if we hadn't managed to get on board Choice, the main consumers organisation. Fortunately, they were interested in it and have been campaigning for years unsuccessfully. Also, other consumer organisations, Consumers Federation of Australia has played a big part, and you've got to work hard to get those organisations involved. Currently, and Geoff may be interested in this, in the recent submissions to the federal government calling for changes to the code, we've tried to get on board organisations that are interested in consumers that have got disability. And we managed to get one group to do that. Pretty tough because they've got, big agenda items such as the ones you've been discussing today. But we were successful there. Councils of Social Service we've got on board, but again, they've got higher priorities. So it isn't easy, but I think that's the only way forward. You can't do it on your own. And I think in our case, I used the media in an enormous amount. In the last 10 years or so, I have just used the media as much as I possibly could to get publicity for, one, that unit pricing could be better, and secondly, to encourage consumers to use it.
Thanks, Ian. Samantha, I might throw a question to you now. You travelled to the US and to the UK, and you're an Australian, so you know what it's like here. So what observations would you make about, for example, the role of philanthropy in the US in terms of getting seed funding for the sort of shared equity models that you studied?
Yeah, look, I was very lucky to see a group called Landed in San Francisco, which was a group of San Francisco ex-Stanford graduates who had that sort of similar view of that they could tap the sort of Stanford alumni to look at ways to attract philanthropy as the seed investment into shared equity. And they were quite successful. I think the key issue, though, for them and their journey was they were starting from scratch. So the market was not used to this type of product. And so they had spent a lot of time just working with the banking sector to see how that they could influence it. And I think that that's a much harder route to go down than if you look at the shared ownership structure in the UK. Shared ownership's been around 40 years in the UK. And so the private market, when it comes to the market, or the philanthropic market, when it comes to the market, there's already evidence, there's already proof, there's already databases, data collection activities that can underpin their sort of investment strategies. So I certainly think you have to start at sort of the government investment side first. And then I think you'll get in a position where you've built up enough, where a proof of concept, I guess, in the marketplace, where you can then attract sort of the philanthropic and the sort of private investment. But I think it's a much harder road unless government has sort of paved the foundations.
Thanks, Samantha. I'll be in touch. I've got a question now from Jacqueline Conn that Jacqueline would like to ask Cassandra. Cassandra, should we be reporting all the scam phone calls we receive? If we so do we report to ScamWatch or to somewhere else?
Scam phone calls. I mean, the irony of this is that I actually received one during Geoff's presentation on my mobile phone. So they're the bane of all our existence. In terms of reporting, you certainly can report it to ScamWatch. I guess one of the challenges in this space is that a lot of the advice says go to ScamWatch. And ScamWatch is an amazing website, scamwatch.gov.au. I'd highly encourage everyone to go there. But ScamWatch and the ACCC don't have any kind of individual investigative capabilities. So referring people to that particular website to report all different types of frauds that they experience is quite, I think, redundant in my thoughts, because when people report, they usually want action of some sort, whereas if you're reporting to ScamWatch, it's really just for education, prevention, and some disruption activities that the ACCC do. It's certainly great for me as a researcher because a lot of my work, I use stats from ScamWatch and from the ACCC, so it's a value and benefit to me as an individual researcher. But from a victim perspective, being continually told to report to ScamWatch, I think is problematic because they don't have that investigative capability. They won't respond to individual complaints because that's not their remit. They're not resourced to do it. But ACMA, the Australian Communications Media Authority, have been doing work in this space around the spam phone calls. They've got a project, they've got a code which was released late last year in 2020 So there is work in this space, but the volume of calls that we are now receiving, it was brought up on Q&A the other night, it's quite incredible. And I think that's just one of the things we're witnessing with COVID and globally, that offenders have really embraced the fact that many people are at home, that there's differences in kind of, I guess, our working patterns and our communication patterns, and they're really embracing and targeting people at a scale that we haven't previously seen.
Thanks, Cass. Jackie Charles has a question for Samantha. Samantha, how can we convince Australian governments and banks to adopt these types of models and additionally change the views of social style housing?
Yeah, it's one of the challenges, I guess, for government is, you know, they're usually quite reticent to spend money in the sort of social and affordable space because it's very expensive, and obviously the returns are very low because the level of rents are very low. This model, in my mind, is a more appetising option for both parties in terms of being able to probably hit more households. The dollar goes further, essentially, in terms of the ability to assist. The downside, though, is that while the subsidy requirements are significantly lower, you've got to be in it for the long haul. So, you know, you're talking at a minimum of at least 10 years before you might look to recycle some of the funds. And so it requires some, you know, fairly proactive long-term policy positioning by the federal government to say, you know, we're investing in this asset class and we're happy to do so for 40, 50 years like the UK has done. I think that's really the trigger point. So yes, it requires less subsidy, but unfortunately you need to have a longer term mindset because you can't force these households to, you know, move out or revalue. You've got to be mindful of their own, you know, household circumstances. So I think government certainly is critical, as I sort of talked about earlier, in terms of paving the way, creating the databases and that knowledge. And I think, you know, it politically and from a voter perspective, you'll touch more people as long as you're willing to be in it for a long time.
Thank you, Samantha. Geoff, we've all got ageing family members. So thinking about a potential transition into aged care, what would be your top tip to somebody who is facing that situation?
Good question, Damian. Look, I think I'd go back to one of my opening comments. We don't tend to plan for old age. We tend to be in denial about our need for aged care or possible need for aged care. And look, I have to say, not everyone ends up there. But, you know, I think that planning, that talking to your family about it, I think things around enduring powers of attorney and advanced health directives, we're all told how incredibly important it is to have those as part of our planning for getting older. Not a lot of us do it. And when we do it, we tend to think this is what I should do, as in putting my family members there. But maybe, you know, they're not the best people to be our attorney. So, you know, do your research, get to understand. And I guess, you know, at the end of the day, I'll put a plug in for OPAN, the Older Persons Advocacy Network. I didn't explain who they were. It's a national network of aged care advocates. And if you're having difficulties either accessing the aged care system or you're having difficulties in there using the aged care system, it's the simplest 1-800 number in the country. It's 1-800-700-600. And wherever you're calling from, it will take you to your state or territory organisation. So, you know, it's about research, it's about planning, it's about talking to your family, not waiting for the crisis.
It's great advice. Thanks, Geoff. Just looking at the time, I've got a question for Ian in just a second. We've only got 2 or 3 minutes, so I'd like to take the opportunity now, in case we get cut off at 3:30, to thank once again all our presenters for an absolutely fascinating and enjoyable session. It's just wonderful to hear from such experts in the field, and it's been a really enjoyable opportunity for us to hear from you all. Ian, there are still some challenges with unit pricing and how to improve it. What would you recommend that anybody who's interested in this unit pricing improvement do to bring about those sort of changes?
Number one, complain to the ACCC when you're not satisfied with what you see in the supermarket. That's really, really important. And also push for with the politicians and anywhere you can for the extension to other shops, because it would be a huge benefit. It frustrates the hell out of me every time I go to the Bunnings to buy stuff, and I haven't got the unit prices there for me to compare things.
Thanks very much, Ian. We've got 1 minute left, so I might bring the session now to a close so that nobody's interrupted. Thanks once again, and I look forward to seeing you at the dinner tonight if you're going, and if not, hopefully around the traps. And thanks again to our presenters. Thanks again to everybody who tuned in. I hope you got a lot out of the session. Thank you.